Hi, all. Welcome to what week are we in? We're in week four. So, this week I'd like to introduce three new art periods to you. They're Impressionism, Post Impressionism, and Cubism. Just quickly, so getting right into it, Impressionism from 1874 to 1880. The statement that I put with Impressionism, it's what the eye sees, not the mind. And this perfectly describes what the Impressionist artists were trying to do. They would go to an original scene, landscape, any type of environment, and what they want to do is capture your first impression when you come up into this environment, this whatever you're looking at. And the way that they primarily did that is capturing the reflection of light. And so, actually, in your book on page 377, you have this painting by Claude Monet, which was one of the first paintings during this that started defining this time period. Is what Monet is trying to do is capture your first impression of what smoke looks like realistically, without going in and processing what you're seeing and adding your filters all around this. And so, this the train station, early morning, trying to capture the exact way that the light would be reflected to you and what you'd see. What's interesting about what the eye sees, not the mind, is it really describes how we change and add our own filters and ideas and biases based on what we see in life. So we look out the window and we start processing everything through what we know and what we understand. The artist wanted to take this away and just have you capture. They just tried to capture what you're, if you didn't add any kind of interpretation of what you're looking at, what that scene looks like. So a lot of times they're outdoor scenes. Monet has a whole series of water lilies where he would walk out in his backyard. He had a pond out there with water lilies. And he would capture this, and he would do it every day. And depending on the light, the cloud cover, where the sun was, the lighting in the picture would always look different. And so he had a full series where he would capture that. The characteristics of Impressionism is it had a rough finish, not a lot of details. Matter of fact, if you look on page 378, another Monet is Impression Sunrise. That was created in 1872. This is another perfect example of what Impressionism looks like. As a matter of fact, a great way to test that is if you look, there's a little black figure in the middle of this painting. And in context, you're saying, of course, it's two people in a boat in the middle of the bay, the harbor, wherever that is, that on the water. And if you took that out of context, you wouldn't know what that was. That's how rough and unfinished the details in this are. But of course, in context, it's like, of course, it's two people in a boat. Small dabs of color were common. Separate strokes of paint, where before artists would spend a lot of time and energy really blending colors and the details. The Impressionists weren't as worried with this. Subjects were often landscapes and ordinary people. What else is in there? So you have actually another on 379, Renoir. This painting is reflecting, it gives you an idea of what, as the artists are trying to capture the light coming through the trees. And then on this party of people dancing and having a good time. And so this is another highly recognized painting from the Impressionist time period. Degas is another artist that is from the Impressionism period. Edgar Degas, he had a whole series with ballerinas where he was trying to work with the natural lighting that was coming through the windows, and then as the ballerinas were reflected from this impression. On page 381, Auguste Rodin, the thinker, is a recognizable sculpture of this time. Mary Cassatt, the boating party. I'm on page 381 in your book. This painting is, once again, fits all the characteristics of Impressionism. The story behind this, matter of fact, there was a lot written about this because Mary Cassatt was it was a feministic perspective where you have the woman and her baby who are being rowed out across the river, a nice afternoon on the lake, and the guy rowing doesn't look very happy because he's not used to having being paid in service of a woman that's beneath him at that time. Um, all right, so that's Impressionism. Um, Impressionism, following directly after Post-Impressionism, is from 1884 to 1905. That it goes where Impressionism was 1874 to 1880. Now we do Post-Impressionism. You still have your separate colors, but is what's happening. In matter of fact, we're transitioning to cubism, but the brushstrokes are becoming bolder, stronger. They're still separate. The shape, and then the artists are in post-impression are starting to separate the world into shapes. And matter of fact, you can see that on 383 with Paul Cézanne. You can see that this landscape with the mountain in the distance, the world is actually becoming strong brushstrokes, which actually are starting to make shapes. And you can actually see the progression of this. Matter of fact, Cézanne is such a great artist where you can really follow. He's also associated with cubism, and you can see as his paintings are moving along the progression, how it gets to where you'll eventually see the cubist painting. But another George Seurat, this painting on 382 is really another nice example where we're talking about one of the characteristics of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism is the separate dabs of color. Well, Seurat actually takes this to the extreme where this painting is little dabs of color that don't touch, and it's called pointillism. And so you look at it and you think, if you looked at it from a distance, you think, oh, those colors blend together and it's normal style, but actually uses separate dots to make the blending and to make the color. Pointillism and Post-Impressionism. Also, an interesting thing that's happening during Post-Impressionism is the artists are starting to allow symbolism to enter their art, where up to this point, the artists have been very committed to representing the world as it was and not altering it. And so we are starting to see the introduction of abstraction, taking the world and the artists interpreting it the way they want to see it. So even starting with Impressionism, by creating these rough brushstrokes and not worrying about the minute details. You know what you're looking at, but you're not getting the details to tell you exactly what to look like. So it's a different way of representing the world. The statement for Post-Impressionism is make thoughts and feelings visible. And matter of fact, this is probably one of the most recognized paintings that you guys will look at is Vincent van Gogh's The Starry Night. This is actually a perfect painting for Post-Impressionism. And the reason why is because of the sky, the bold brushstrokes that you see that create this moving motion, the turbulence, and it's made particularly by Van Gogh's brushstrokes and the strong brushstrokes, and you can see them in the direction and move your eye across the painting. On page, another artist during this time, actually, it's funny, they spend a lot of time on Post-Impressionism. On page 387, Paul Gauguin is an artist that's well represented during this time. What we have in the book is his series where he went to Tahiti, actually left his wife and kids, shacked up with some Tahitian woman and made a life there and did this series that we often see. But also this particular painting is a great example of where the symbolism is seen. So for instance, you have the women on the front bank where you have birth, life, and death represented in the three figures. Also, you can see that the artists are starting to feel comfortable with, in this case, Gauguin makes orange water or red water, and that's not the color of the water, but he's comfortable starting to alter the way that he's representing the world and using and feeling comfortable with symbolism and metaphors. And then finally, the last painting that I like to talk about as far as representing post-impressionism and allowing you to see the artist's hand is on page 390, and it's Edvard Munch, The Scream, which once again, that's a pretty recognizable painting illustration. I think it's interesting because one in 2012, I believe it was, this painting sold for $119 million. And first of all, it's not a painting. It's a colored pencil and chalk and pastel. It's on an 8.5. Well, in this case, this one's larger. The one that was sold on a. There's a number of a series of this Scream actually, and one of them was like on a standard 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and you're thinking $119 million. How does that happen? But if you think about my lecture about art periods and what creates art periods, and it's not necessarily about the art, it's about the ideas that are surfacing and the zeitgeist of the time and the thinking overall tone, and that the art just simply reflects this as an illustration of this. And so Munch would be an artist at this time that is representing the characteristics of this new way of thinking, and this illustration is simply what he created to show us that. And that's the, even though you look at the Scream and you think my 4-year-old brother could create that, I could create that, it actually is perfect as far as showing the characteristics and the new thinking of the time. And you can see the artist's hand in everything about it, from the strokes of the charcoal and pastels and colored pencil, and the way that your eye moves through it based on the lines that are created by the artist's hand. So that is post-impressionism, and it makes thoughts and feelings visible, and that's what it looks like, to actually have these feelings that you're seeing from the painting, but literally feeling them and seeing what they look like. Finally, we go to cubism. Cubism from 1905 to 1918. And probably the best known artist from this time, and also the person that was maybe most influential, and this was Pablo Picasso. You can see on page 14 one of the first paintings that was done that represented this time. It doesn't have the extremes of the time period, but it's one of the first that started. The artists are taking the world and dividing up into geometric shapes. So before this, in Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, we're getting these bold brushstrokes. And as the bold brushstrokes are on the canvas, they actually are dividing the world into these geometric shapes. Now the cubists take it a step further and actually divide the world into geometric shapes. And you can see these female forms that are triangles and curves and rectangles to create these figures that we see as women. On the next page, 401, George Rock is an artist that is well recognized, and you can see in his paintings that you do see the squares, and even the trees are geometric shapes that they're dividing up the world and segmenting it. And then on page another Brock is George Brock is an artist that's definitely created a lot of work during this time. On 402, you can see it. One of the things I like to point out is, so the artists are getting more comfortable abstracting the world. What's interesting, and it goes along with the progression, is that in their titles, they're very literal. They'll tell you what they're trying to do, even though the painting is a very abstract representation. So Brock, this is called the Portuguese. You look at that, I don't see a Portuguese, but that's what he was creating. And maybe if you look at it, you can see pieces of it. The thing that I like to, actually perfect, is what, so staying with that for a minute. As a matter of fact, you can go to, on page 403, you can see two Pablo Picasso's, a sculpture, the guitar that he created, and then another one called Violin, Fruit, and Wine Glass. But it's what I like to do when I describe cubism, just so you can understand what they're thinking. Because, is what happens is we look at the art and like, I don't get that. What's going on there? And that's stupid. I'd never hang that on my wall, and I certainly wouldn't pay $119 million for it. But your job is not to decide whether you like it or not. It's for you to understand it. So is what the cubists were trying to do, so you can see where they're coming from, is they would take a scene, let's say the Mona Lisa, right? And they would try to represent all the different perspectives at once, at the same time, on a 2D plane. So from the front, from the side, from the back, from the top, the artists are trying to capture all these different sides at one time. As a matter of fact, the statement for this is it shows objects as the mind rather than the eye perceives them. So the Impressionists were trying to show you how you saw the world before you added any kind of thinking. Now the Cubists are saying, okay, really, in essence, what's happening is you're getting all these different ideas, these visions, these objects coming into your mind, and then your brain sorts through them. So they want, before you sort it through them, this isn't even when you add interpretation to it. They're trying to say, okay, all this is coming in your head. I want to see what that looks like before you go and sort through it and try to understand it. So that's where they come in and they have this picture, but they want to show all the different sides of it at once because that's what we see. But what we understand takes a lot of work as far as interpreting. But they don't stop here. What they do next, as I've said, is they divide the world into geometric shapes. So you take all those different perspectives, divide it in geometric shapes, and then they do one more thing. They take all these different little squares of different perspectives and mix them up. They mix them up and put them back together. And that's Cubist art. So if you look on page 402, that's what you're looking at. The artist taking the world, dividing it up into different shapes, mixing it up, and putting it back together. On page 403, Picasso's work, you can see where he's done that. But you know, the best example, and Marcel Duchamp is an artist that was during Cubist period, but he also will see him in later art periods where he's creating work that is predominant. So for instance, like Dada, we'll talk about Marcel Duchamp. But on page 409, actually what Duchamp does, so he takes his character, of course in this case it's a nude walking down the stairs, of course, right? And then divide it up into geometric shapes and get all those different perspectives and then mix it all up and put it back together on a 2D plane. So there's no perspective, no shading, no depth. These are characteristics of the Cubist art period. But what Duchamp did is he took one extra element. He wanted to show motion from the beginning to end all at the same time. So you have a nude descending the stairs and what that would look like if all those steps, each step of the stairs, each step of the motion, all those different angles, divided up, mixed up, put back together. This is how Marcel Duchamp shows that. And that's on page 409. And I always, in my in-class, with my face-to-face classes, I always have them practice that just to see if you can do it. And I'll tell you, it's tough. And so where you want to say Cubist, what the heck, if you try to do it, like, okay, I kind of see it. And they got a little bit close here, or they kind of missed it there, but yeah, I got it. This is not easy. And that's what the artists are trying to do. And that's what our job is, to try to understand what's going on, what they're trying to accomplish. And then we can gauge or judge or assess how closely they did it, or at least just understand it. Pablo Picasso, Paul Cézanne, Georges Braque, Marcel Duchamp, Marc Chagall. These are artists during the Cubist art period. Now, so that's a quick run by of the three art periods that you'll have for this week. The one other thing I wanted to talk to you about was the art exercise that you'll do this week. And basically is what you're doing is you're simply finding a classic work of art, and you are recreating that work of art, and then you're putting it next to the original work of art. So we can see your creation next to the original work. Make sure you always list the artist's name, the title of the work, year it was completed, one visual element about that work of art, the subject of the art, where that's just looking at trying to understand what's going on within the art period, and one characteristic of that area. So that's your assignment. I'd be anxious to see what you create. This isn't an art class. You're not judged. You don't get a better grade if you're really a talented artist or if you just do stick figures. It's fine. But the reason I really like this exercise is because it makes you look at the art closely to reproduce it. And that's the tough part. And that's what it takes to understand art and have a true appreciation. You first got to look at it closely, understand the elements, look at what the artist's intention was, look at what it takes, the process to recreate that art. You see all those things, and you all of a sudden get this deeper understanding of the art. And that's what we're doing here. So